Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be talking about cannabis.
Oh, yeah.
It's been in the news a lot lately, and there's
Okay.
this really fascinating article that I've been looking at
Okay.
that kind of goes into some of the newer research and some of the findings and kind of the direction that things are going.
Yeah.
Um, and I think one of the most striking things for me right off the bat
Mm-hmm.
was that more people in the U.S. are using cannabis daily
Wow.
than they are alcohol.
That's pretty amazing.
Yeah, so I thought that was really interesting. It sort of shows just how much
Yeah.
things are changing.
Times are changing for sure.
Yeah, so I thought that was pretty interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting how, we've moved beyond the stigma to an extent,
Yeah,
and we're really trying to have an informed dialogue and be responsible.
exactly. And, one of the things that the article points out is how much more potent cannabis is
Right.
than it was in the past.
Yeah.
Like, we're talking THC levels have, like, more than doubled in recent decades.
Really?
Yeah,
Like, wow.
yeah. So that's a pretty big jump and something to think about.
It is a big jump,
Yeah,
and it makes you think that with this increased potency, we need to really pay attention
yeah,
to the effects, both positive and negative. We
absolutely.
have to be careful about that.
And so you've got that increase in potency happening at the same time as more people using it every day.
Right.
And one of the things the article brings up is the decriminalization debate.
Mm-hmm.
And it compares cannabis to alcohol
Okay.
and notes that, alcohol is actually linked to 1 in 20 deaths globally.
Wow.
Yeah,
That's something.
that's a pretty startling statistic.
Yeah, it's kind of a sobering thought, isn't it?
Yeah,
When you think about it in those terms.
it does make you think.
Yeah, and it really fuels those arguments about, decriminalization.
Right.
And why is one legal when it causes so much harm and the other one isn't?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the big question, isn't it?
It is a big question.
Like, what do you think about that comparison?
Well, you know, it's really interesting to think about, because alcohol is so ingrained in our culture,
Right.
but at the same time, it's causing so much harm,
Yeah,
and it's a real dilemma.
it is.
Yeah.
So let's switch gears a little bit and talk about this idea that cannabis isn't addictive,
Okay.
because that's one of the things that this article really dives into,
Mm-hmm.
and says that that's actually a myth, and that around 10% of users
Yeah.
develop what's called cannabis use disorder, or CUD.
Okay.
And I think it's important to understand like what CUD actually means.
Yeah.
Like, what does that mean?
Well, think about somebody who can't start their day without coffee.
Right.
They have to have that coffee and
Mhm.
apply that to cannabis.
Oh, okay.
That's kind of what it is.
No, so it's that feeling of needing it rather than wanting it.
Exactly.
Got it.
It takes over. Even if it's causing problems in their lives.
And the article doesn't kind of shy away from the withdrawal symptoms.
Yeah.
Like, it's not just, oh, you're going to feel a little irritable.
Right.
Think of the worst night's sleep you've ever had
Uh,
and like amplify that feeling.
wow.
That's kind of the description of what some of these withdrawal symptoms can be like.
So that would make it really difficult to stop using, even if
Oh.
you knew you should.
Absolutely.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's it's a pretty intense thing.
Yeah, it sounds like it.
But here's where I think it gets even more interesting.
Okay.
So while some people use cannabis for relaxation,
Right.
this article suggests that heavy use can actually lead to the opposite,
Oh, really?
like increased anxiety, irritability, even paranoia.
Huh. So it can actually increase those feelings.
Yeah, it's kind of a paradox.
Interesting.
So
So you think they're doing it to relax, but
Oh.
actually it's making you more anxious.
Right, and it can even lead to like this kind of mental numbness
Hmm.
and social withdrawal and emotional blunting.
So it's almost like avoiding those tough emotions
Right.
instead of confronting them.
Exactly. And,
That's kind of scary.
it makes you wonder about the long-term effects, on personal growth
Yeah.
and emotional intelligence and things like that.
Especially for teenagers,
Oh,
like that's a really critical time
Absolutely.
for development.
And the article specifically calls that out
Mm-hmm.
and says that, the younger you start,
Right.
the higher the risk of developing these serious mental health issues later in life,
Oh, wow.
like psychosis and schizophrenia.
That's pretty serious.
Yeah. And, remember those super potent strains we were talking about earlier?
Right.
Yeah.
So it's probably make it even worse.
They amplify these risks,
Yeah.
especially for young brains that are still developing.
It's like playing with fire, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. And so,
You might think you're in control, but the consequences
right.
could be really bad.
Yeah. And so I think, before we go any further,
Okay.
we need to talk about this other area
All right.
where cannabis can have a really big impact,
Right.
and that is cognitive function.
Right.
So we're talking memory learning, reasoning,
Yeah.
all those essential things that our brains do.
Right. All those important
Yeah.
things. We need to be able to think clearly.
Right. And it's almost like cannabis can put this like temporary fog
Hmm.
over those abilities.
Interesting.
So if you're using it heavily,
Right.
it can be harder to learn new things,
Right.
to focus your attention to make good decisions.
So it's not just about feeling, high or relaxed.
Right.
It's actually affecting how your brain works.
Exactly.
Optic level.
Yeah, and so this is another area where that idea of responsible use is so important.
Absolutely. We need to be aware of how much we're using
Right.
and how it's affecting us.
Yeah, and I think, that brings up this question of like,
Mm.
okay, so we're learning all this stuff about cannabis. Like, how do we navigate this whole landscape? How do we separate fact from fiction?
Yeah.
And make good choices?
Those are great questions.
Yeah. And so I think,
And that's something that we'll continue to explore
okay,
as we continue this deep dive.
awesome. Looking forward to it.
Yeah.
All right, we'll be back after a quick break.
So before the break, we were talking about how cannabis can affect our thinking and our brains.
Right, like all those cognitive functions.
Exactly. And here's a bit of good news, though.
Okay.
For many people, those effects actually get better after they stop using cannabis.
Oh, okay, that's good to know.
Yeah.
But I'm curious about the long-term effects.
Yeah.
Like, is there a chance of like permanent damage?
Right.
That's something I think a lot of people worry about.
Yeah. And it's a great question. And honestly, it's something that researchers are still looking into.
Oh, okay.
So we're learning more all the time about, the long-term impact of cannabis on the brain.
So we're kind of like pioneers in a way.
Yeah. In a way, we are.
Like exploring this new territory.
That's a great way to put it.
And as we're exploring it, it's important to be responsible and to make good choices
Absolutely.
about how we use it.
Informed choices.
Yeah. And speaking of responsible use,
Yeah.
one of the things that this article really emphasizes is that cannabis isn't inherently good or bad.
Right.
It's really about being informed and understanding the nuances so you can make the best choices for yourself.
It's about giving you the power
Uh,
to, direct your own experience.
I like that analogy of being the director.
Yeah.
Okay,
Of your own experience.
what are some of the things that the article suggests when it comes to responsible use?
Sure. Well, one of the biggest takeaways, I think, is timing.
Yeah.
So if you're in your teens or 20s,
Right.
delaying cannabis use can significantly reduce your risks.
Oh, okay.
Those are really critical years for your brain development.
Yeah, your brain's still forming. at
It's
that
that
age.
point. And early exposure can have some long-lasting effects.
It's like you're building a house, and if you rush the foundations, the whole thing could be messed up.
The whole structure is compromised.
Right. Okay, so delaying use while your brain is still under construction.
Yeah.
Makes a lot of sense.
Makes a lot of sense.
What about for adults who choose to use it?
Yeah, well, for adults, I think the key is moderation.
Okay.
Finding that sweet spot
Right.
where you can enjoy the potential benefits
Mm-hmm.
without, having those negative consequences.
It's like anything else in life, right?
It is.
Too much of a good thing can be bad.
Exactly.
But how do we navigate that in a world where cannabis is becoming more and more mainstream?
Right.
We see it everywhere.
It's true. You see it in movies, on TV, even in advertisements. It's
Yeah.
really becoming part of the culture.
So how do we educate people, especially young people, about responsible cannabis use?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it's a challenge that we need to address as a society.
Right, because that old just say no approach,
Yeah, that's not going to cut it.
probably not going to work anymore.
We need a more, nuanced and realistic approach.
Okay, so what would that look like?
Well, I think it starts with education
Okay.
and, being honest
Mhm.
about both the potential benefits and the risks.
So like a Cannabis 101.
Exactly. And it needs to be presented in a way that respects young people's intelligence.
Right.
Treat them like adults in training.
Give them the facts.
Exactly. And trust them to make
Mhm.
informed decisions.
And this education can't just be a one-time thing, right?
No, it needs to be an ongoing conversation.
Okay.
And it's a conversation that needs to involve parents, educators, healthcare providers, and even the cannabis industry.
Wow, so it's really like a collaborative effort.
It is. We all need to work together on this.
And it's almost like we need a cultural shift in how we think about this.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Create a space where young people feel comfortable asking questions and getting guidance without judgment.
Exactly. It's about empowerment. not about fear.
And it's not just about young people either, right?
No, it's about adults, too.
Yeah.
Adults who choose to use cannabis, they need to have access to reliable information as well.
It's an ongoing learning process for everyone.
It is.
So we're always learning new things about cannabis.
Exactly. And that brings us back to one of the key points that the article raises.
Okay.
The comparison between cannabis and alcohol.
Right. And the article really emphasized that while both can have negative consequences,
That's right.
alcohol's impact on global health is actually much greater.
It is. And that statistic about 1 in 20 deaths worldwide being linked to alcohol.
Yeah.
It's pretty powerful.
Yeah, it's pretty sobering.
It really makes you think about, how we approach these different substances.
So how did that tie into our conversation about cannabis?
Well, I think it highlights the need for, a more nuanced discussion and regulation. We need to move beyond these simple good versus bad arguments.
Right.
And really look at the science.
And that applies to both alcohol and cannabis.
It does. We need to be responsible.
Yeah.
With both.
It's about empowering people to make informed choices
Exactly.
about their own health and well-being.
Regardless of their choices.
And that brings us to another really crucial point that I want to make sure we hit on from this article.
Yeah.
And that is the dramatic increase in THC levels
Oh, yeah.
that we've seen in cannabis products over the last few decades.
Right. It's not your grandma's weed anymore.
Definitely not.
It's much more potent.
Yeah, and that changes things significantly
It does.
because those higher THC levels
Right.
can lead to more intense effects.
Right. Which some people might be looking for.
Right.
But it also increases the likelihood of those negative side effects.
Especially for people who are new to cannabis.
Exactly. Or who are sensitive to it.
It's almost like turning up the volume.
Yeah.
It might be fun at first, but it can quickly become overwhelming.
And even damaging.
Yeah. So another area where education is so important.
Absolutely.
You got to know what you're getting into.
People need to be aware of the potency of what they're using.
It's like taking any medication.
Exactly.
You wouldn't just swallow a handful of pills without knowing what they were.
You need to know the dosage.
Right.
And how it's going to affect you.
And speaking of how it's going to affect you,
Right.
the different ways that you consume cannabis
Oh, yeah.
can have really different effects too,
That's true.
right?
Yeah.
So smoking, vaping edibles,
All different.
they all kind of have their own timeline
Yeah.
and effects.
And that's where things can get a little tricky,
Right.
especially for people who are new to cannabis.
Especially with edibles.
Yeah, edibles can be a real challenge
Yeah.
because the effects are delayed and often more intense than people expect.
Start low and go slow.
Exactly.
Good advice.
And be patient.
Okay.
It takes a while for the effects to kick in.
Now let's talk a little bit more about cannabis addiction,
Okay.
because the article does a really good job of debunking the myth that cannabis isn't addictive.
Right, addresses that head on.
Yeah, and it says that while many people can use it without developing any problems,
Right.
addiction is a real possibility,
It is.
especially with frequent use of those high THC products
Yeah,
and starting at a young age.
that's right.
So it's kind of like any other substance that can be habit-forming.
It is.
It's important to be aware of the risks and
To-
to know the signs
Exactly.
of addiction. So what are some of the things that people should be looking out for?
Well, one of the key things is a loss of control.
But,
When you know cannabis starts to take over your life,
right,
even when it's causing problems.
like you need it
Yeah, that feeling of needing it.
rather than wanting it.
Exactly.
Got it.
And the article really emphasizes that addiction is not simple.
Okay.
It's not just about willpower or a lack of self-control.
So there are other factors at play?
There are, biological factors, psychological factors, social factors.
It's like a puzzle
Yeah.
with many pieces. Okay. What are some of those risk factors that the article mentions?
Well, as we've already talked about,
Yeah.
frequent use of those high THC products is a big one.
Okay.
Starting young is another one. And then there are underlying mental health conditions.
So it's not just about the substance itself.
Right.
It's also about the person
Exactly.
who's using it.
It's about the individual, their history, their genetics, their mental health, their environment.
So it's really complex.
It is.
And that's why addiction treatment needs to be individualized.
Absolutely. One size fits all doesn't work.
Right. Okay. So we need to look at the whole picture
We do.
and meet people where they're at.
Yeah, and provide the support they need.
Okay. Now let's talk about the relationship between cannabis and mental health,
Okay.
because this is an area where I think things can get a little blurry,
You can.
because it's not as simple as saying cannabis is good or bad for your mental health.
No.
What are some of the things that the article says about that?
Well, the article acknowledges that some people might find that cannabis helps them to relax
Okay.
or to manage stress, in the short term.
Yeah.
But it also cautions that heavy or frequent use can actually worsen those issues,
Oh, wow.
especially for people who are already prone to anxiety or depression or even psychosis.
So it's like walking a tightrope.
Yeah,
There's potential for benefit,
right.
but you could also fall off.
You could, and the article explores some of those specific concerns,
Okay.
increased anxiety, paranoia,
Mm-hmm.
and even psychotic episodes.
Psychosis, that sounds serious.
It
What's
is.
the connection there?
Well, the research suggests that heavy cannabis use, particularly those high THC strains,
Right.
can trigger these episodes
Yeah, okay.
in people who are already vulnerable.
So it's not that cannabis causes psychosis,
Right.
but it can make it worse.
It can trigger it
Okay.
in those who are already at risk.
So it's important to know your family history
Yeah,
and to talk to a doctor
absolutely.
if you have concerns.
It's about being proactive
Right.
with your mental health.
Okay. And also recognizing that cannabis can interact with existing mental health conditions,
It can.
making things worse.
Exactly.
So it's not just about developing new problems.
Right.
It's also about...
It's about managing existing conditions.
Right. Okay, now let's switch gears and talk about how cannabis affects our thinking,
Okay.
our memory, our attention, our learning, all of that.
Right. The article calls these the cognitive conundrums
I like that.
of cannabis use.
Okay, so what are some of the things that we need to know?
Well, heavy cannabis use can impair those abilities.
Okay.
Memory, attention, executive function, even motor skills.
So it really is affecting how our brains work
It is?
at a basic level.
Yeah. And these effects can be especially concerning for young people.
Right, because their brains are still developing.
Exactly.
So what are some of the long-term risks of starting young?
Well, research suggests that it can have long-term consequences for their development, potentially affecting, academic performance, career prospects, even their overall quality of life.
So it's not just a temporary thing.
No, it can have lasting impacts.
Wow.
And what's even more concerning is that some of these effects can persist
Even after they stop using it.
even after they stop using it.
So it's really important to be mindful,
It is.
especially during those teenage years
Yeah, adolescence, young adulthood.
when the brain is still developing.
Those are critical times.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground today,
We have.
from the science to the social trends
Mhm.
to the risks and the benefits.
It's a complex topic.
It is. And as we wrap up this part of our deep dive,
Yeah.
it's important to remember that we're still learning
We are.
about cannabis.
The research is constantly evolving.
So it's like we're explorers
Yeah.
venturing into this new territory
We are.
with each study that comes out.
And that means we need to stay informed.
Yeah.
We need to challenge our assumptions. And we need to keep having these conversations.
Open and honest conversations
Exactly.
about cannabis.
We need to move beyond the stigma and the myths and really focus on the science.
and create a society where people feel empowered
Yes.
to make informed choices for themselves.
That's the goal.
All right, so as we head into the final part of this deep dive,
Okay.
I want to leave you with a question to think about.
All right.
With legalization becoming more and more common, how do we as a society best educate people, especially young people, about responsible cannabis use?
That's a great question. And it's a challenge that requires all of us to work together.
Parents, educators,
Yeah.
policymakers, healthcare providers,
Everyone.
even the cannabis industry.
We need to make sure that people have the information they need
Yeah.
to make healthy choices.
All right. So we're back for the final part of our cannabis deep dive.
It's been a fascinating journey for sure.
It has been. We've covered a lot of ground.
We
I
have.
feel like we've learned so much.
Me too.
So before we wrap up completely, let's kind of like highlight some of those key takeaways.
Okay, sounds good.
One of the things that really stood out to me was just like how many factors influence how cannabis affects us.
Right. It's not just the plant itself.
It's not just about like, is it good or is it bad?
Exactly.
It's about the person, the strain, how much you use, even how you consume it.
It's like all these different pieces.
Yeah, it's like a recipe with a bunch of different ingredients.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to personalize your approach.
Right, like what works for one person might not work for another.
Exactly. You got to figure out what works for you.
And that makes me think about how we often hear people comparing cannabis to alcohol.
Right. That comes up a lot.
And the article really highlighted that while both can have negative consequences, alcohol's impact on global health is actually way worse.
It is. And that's something that we really need to consider.
That statistic about 1 in 20 deaths worldwide being linked to alcohol.
Yeah, that's pretty heavy.
It is pretty sobering.
It makes you think about how we approach these different substances as a society.
For sure. For sure. And I know for me, one of the biggest takeaways was realizing that even though cannabis is often seen as this natural substance, it can still be addictive.
Yeah, that surprised a lot of people.
It did that around 10% of users developing cannabis use disorder.
That's a significant number.
It really challenges that idea that it's totally harmless.
Exactly. Addiction is a real thing, and it can affect anyone.
And speaking of things that can affect anyone, our conversation about mental health and cannabis,
Oh, yeah, that was a big one.
that was a roller coaster ride.
It was.
Because it's not as simple as saying cannabis is good or bad for your mental health.
Right. It's much more nuanced than that.
It is.
Yeah.
So what do we do with all this information?
Well, I think the most important thing is to remember that knowledge is power.
Okay, I like it. That knowledge is power.
So the more you understand about cannabis, the better choices you can make.
So keep learning.
Keep learning. Stay curious.
Be your own cannabis expert.
Exactly.
And speaking of choices, the article really emphasized that idea of responsible use.
Right. It's not about being pro or anti-cannabis.
It's about making choices that are right for you.
Exactly. You're in control of your own experience.
You get to decide if and how cannabis fits into your life.
And if you do choose to use it, moderation is key.
Okay, moderation.
Listen to your body and pay attention to how you feel.
Find that balance.
Exactly.
Well, I think that's a great note to end on.
It is.
This deep dive has given us a lot to think about.
It has.
And I hope it's empowered our listeners to navigate the world of cannabis with a little more knowledge and a lot more confidence.
Absolutely. It's an exciting time to be learning about cannabis.
It is so. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and most importantly, take care of yourselves.